If you want to become a great home gardener but don't want to spend years and years of failing before you get to finally work out what it takes to have a great garden, listen up, because this is everything that beginners really need to know that you're usually not going to find in other beginner tutorials. If you're someone who's new to gardening or wants to get into it, or maybe you've had a few growing seasons that haven't worked out that well, you've clicked on the right video, because this is your ultimate guide to starting gardening, covering the basics in a way that I think a lot of videos skip over, but it's really going to equip you with the tools to set yourself up for success and avoid a lot of the common mistakes that people make when they're first starting out. Let's start with me inside, because I think it's going to start to rain, talking about what are the building blocks that plants actually need to grow, thrive, and survive. All right, what do plants need in really simple terms? Let's try and get through this really quickly and possibly in one take. You're going to save yourself so much pain by knowing the building blocks of what plants need. You'll be able to save yourself a lot of trouble by setting yourself up for success, and you'll also be able to troubleshoot your way through a lot of the problems that you're going to encounter. This generally takes most people 3 to 5 years to actually work out what plants actually need, because a lot of new growers are going to start thinking that plants need water and nothing else. So let's jump right into it. Number one, what do plants need? They of course need water. This shouldn't come as a shock to anyone. This is the one thing that most people are going to know. Plants need water. Water is essentially what fills up the plant cells. They are what comprises most of plants. But what should shock you about this is how much extra spaces are on this board, how many extra things that plants need besides water. Let's talk about number two. Number two is the sun. I think the biggest thing that new growers really underestimate is the importance of the sun. Both how much plants need and how much you can really set yourself up to fail by picking beds or growing positions that are in the wrong position. Plants really need a lot of sun. You may have heard of photosynthesis before. Photosynthesis, in really simple terms, is the plants taking the sun. When it hits the leaves, the plant manages to turn that into sugar that the plant gets to then store and use for things like new growth, putting out fruit, putting out flowers, that sort of thing. It's really, really important. And later on, when we talk about constructing your garden for the first time, this is going to be really important. The next thing is the plants need food. What? I thought that plants eat water. No, you can probably think about water for plants the same way as water for us. It's really, really important. And if we consumed none of it, we would die very quickly. It's the same with plants, but they don't actually eat it. Plants also need food in the soil, primarily nitrogen. There's a lot more that plants need that's going to live in the soil, but nitrogen is the big one. It's the big one that we need to keep feeding into the soil in order for the plants to thrive. This is why gardeners are so obsessed with things like compost and manure and keep putting those onto the garden beds. This is what fertilization is. We fertilize the soil by adding more nitrogen and other things called nitrates, which is the actual form of nitrogen that plants eat. A good way to help you visualize the nitrogen is that a lot of the leafy growth that you see on plants, anytime a plant spawns a new leaf, it's actually used a lot of the nitrogen in the soil to produce that growth, and that's why we need to keep adding it, because the plant physically pulls the nitrogen out of the soil, and usually at some point we're going to harvest that plant and go and put it somewhere else. That's why we need to keep restocking the supply of the plant food in the soil. And as a side note, you may have heard the term nitrogen fixer. It's one of the reasons that we're so obsessed with it is nitrogen fixers are plants that, instead of taking nitrogen from the ground and shooting that up into plant growth, is they take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and then put that in the plant's roots, returning nitrogen to the soil. Number 4. Everything else in this list, new growers probably know to some degree, but the one that I think catches a lot of new gardeners out is heat, and how important, not necessarily heat, but temperature, both ambient temperature and soil temperature, is to plants, and how they know when to sprout from seed, how they know when to germinate, how they know when to put out new growth. And what you get when you have all of these working in the right way is you may ask yourself the question, how do plants know to set fruit in the late summer? How do they know to spring up in early spring? Heat is a big part of that equation, but what the plant is actually doing is plants run on hormones. They think in hormones. They don't have a brain. They take inputs from when the right amount of these are present in their environment, and that lets them send out hormones to the plant to do things like start new growth, germinate the seed, when to die off because it's the season's end. So this is the 80% of all of the knowledge that you need to be a successful gardener, is that these are the inputs that you need to be able to provide for your plants for them to be successful. And more often than not, if you're running into issues with growing your own plants, you're either not providing them one of these or you're providing one of them too much. All right, let's talk about the absolutely most underrated make or break decision that you make when starting a home garden. The bed placement. Why is the bed placement so important? Well, as we just discussed, plants need sun and they need a lot of it. The more sun you can give your plants, the more sugar they can produce, the more plant growth they can produce. And I think a lot of other beginner guides really fail to mention this. But when you're unguided, when trying to work out where to put your plant beds, you can often end up in a lot of bad situations because a lot of people, like I do, really like to squeeze all of their garden beds to the sides of their property so that you can still have a nice big open lawn area or a nice big open entertaining area. But where that can really put you into trouble is if you're putting it against one of the incorrect walls of your house, you're putting it in a spot that is going to get so much more limited sun compared to putting it on the wall that's really optimal for your hemisphere. So how do we actually choose where our beds should go? So to a lot of beginner gardeners or non-gardeners, this idea of some parts of the garden getting more sun than others might not make that much sense because a lot of people think that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But the sun doesn't actually rise in pure east and set in pure west. Because the earth is actually on an axis, what it means is that the sun will come across more so one side of the sky than the other. You may have noticed at home sometimes that on one fence line of your property, there's a lot more shade, and on the other, it's always gets a lot more sun and warmer. So how do you know what part of your yard is going to work the best for a garden patch? If you're like me and in the southern hemisphere, what you want your garden to be is north facing. So my north is on that side, which what that means for me is that because of the Earth's tilt, the sun is going to rise in the east and a little bit north. So it's northeast, which means that it's going to come across and stay north the full day, just a little bit. It will still come overhead, but it's still going to cast a shadow in this direction and then go all the way over to the west and still a little bit north and still cast in that direction. So for someone like me who really does enjoy growing a lot of my own food, but I still try to minimize the footprint of the beds that are taking up in my yard, I still like having quite a nice big lawn that's currently full of wood chips and mulch. But this is my entire south wall, which obviously faces north, and it is covered in beds and things that are growing. I have citrus trees over this side, carrots, onions, entire bed of blueberries, small citrus trees. This is now unused garden bed. Over here I have some of my winter veggies going, garlic starting to sprout, broccoli and cabbage, potatoes in containers over here, nice flowering trees and the lily pilly over here, my raspberries. Essentially the entire real estate of this southern side wall of my property is completely taken up because this is the best growing space. Anywhere else on the house is going to be partially shaded compared to this, which isn't as optimal growing conditions. That's not to say that you can't grow things in the shadier parts of your property. This is somewhere that during the summer we'll get about 8 hours of sun a day. Here in winter, in the cooler months, is only getting 5 or 6 hours a day, but there's still stuff that I'm growing here. You just need to be a lot more picky with what you can grow. Anything that's shade tolerant, like I have beans and radishes and lettuces growing here, they will do fine. They'll also do fine in the sunnier parts, but I can never grow something that really needs to produce a lot of that green growth that requires all that sun to grow. Things like cucumbers and pumpkins that throw out tons and tons of green growth in order to have enough energy to produce its fruit, I'm never going to get in one of these shadier parts. Something that is important to say is that even if you don't have much good growing real estate at your property, you are still going to find a way to grow stuff. If this is all I had, I would be able to make it work. In fact, at my last place, the only spots that I could actually put garden beds got 1 to 2 hours of direct sun a day, and yet I actually still managed to grow a fair bit of produce there. Some other considerations will just be, if you want to grow climbing plants like tomatoes and beans, and you probably will, just think about where you can possibly put trellises or ways to hang them up that's not going to affect the rest of your plant growth. Like what I do here when I'm growing those sort of plants is this entire back row are all my trellis plants. I have a trellis that I put up above this, and then I still get to grow stuff all in the rest of these beds. All right, now that we've decided where we want to grow stuff, let's talk as quickly, as succinctly as we can about how to build our garden beds. I won't go into too much detail because there's quite a lot of resources about this already, but let's give the abridged version. Raised beds are by far the most expensive way to do it. I personally just like the look. I have a bad back. I quite like working up here. They're both quite expensive in material to construct, as well as all of the soil that you need to fill them with is by far going to be the biggest expense in your entire gardening life cycle. The main thing here is that in both raised beds and pots, you can't put in pure compost. There's actually going to be too much nitrogen for your plants in that. You need something like a raised bed mix. The cheapest place to get that will be from a local landscape supply or potentially a nursery that can do bulk delivery. To set your expectations, to fill these raised beds here, I spent nearly $600 on raised bed soil. Next, we have growing in containers. The main thing that I have learnt from my years of experience with containers is just avoid these plastic pots. They're quite useless. What I can't recommend high enough is just to invest straight into grow bags. They are negligibly more expensive and they are so much better. The entire thing is a drainage thing, which a big mistake that new gardeners will make is underestimating how much drainage plants want. The majority of plants don't want wet feet. They want water available to them when they need it, but they don't just want to be sitting in water. Which brings me to, if you are doing in-ground beds, there's quite a lot of material on bed preparation already, but essentially the soil that is already in your ground is probably not going to be that great at sustaining something like a veggie garden. What you're going to have to do is prepare and improve that soil. The abridged version of that is to just make sure you have a way of controlling your weeds, putting down something like cardboard most likely, and then you're going to need to improve the quality of your soil, most likely digging in some compost. This next thing is just so underrated and borderline unknown for new gardeners, is that I used to think that a perfect looking garden is one where you just have your nice, dark, pure black soil and then just your perfect green plant spreading out on top of that. But instead, when you look at a lot of gardening content, is they have either straw or wood chips on top of the bed. Why do they have this? This is mulch, and the purpose of mulch does a couple of really good things. One, it primarily helps lock in moisture to the bed, especially important for raised beds that are going to lose moisture a lot more quickly than the ground soil, because one, there isn't kilometers of soil below it that's able to hold water, and two, because raised beds and containers do manage to hold heat a bit better, the water is going to evaporate a lot quicker. The other big advantage is that by having mulch on top, it's so much harder for weed seeds to germinate and then populate the bed. The biggest tip for mulch is just use whatever's really cheap in your area. Here in Australia, there's so much sugarcane production that this sugarcane mulch is really cheap. And if you are watching in Australia, these bags of sugarcane mulch will last you a just shockingly long amount of time. because it's so compacted inside the bag that by the time you're pulling it out, it's covering a stupid amount of garden bed space. All right, let's cover off and demystify a bunch of the jargon terms that you're going to run into while you're starting your gardening journey. The first one is perennial. A perennial is a plant that will continue to grow for more than 2 years. This is opposed to the majority of the food plants that we grow are actually annuals, where their life cycle is less than a year long, where during the spring they will sprout from seed all through spring and summer, usually will grow towards the end of summer. They will fruit, they will either have animals eat the fruit, take the seeds elsewhere, they'll drop the fruit, etc. Those will get buried, they'll be in the ground over winter, and then once spring comes around again, it spawns a new plant. That's the life cycle of an annual plant. A perennial is something that will stay living throughout the full year. Things like trees are perennials, asparagus is a perennial, rhubarb is a perennial. Which brings us to the next one, annuals. I kind of just explained, but anything that lives for less than a year and life cycle is based on that year is an annual. Side note, but there are also biannual plants. Things like onions are actually biannuals, where they will start from a seed, they will grow for a full year, they will produce a stem that will then die off over the winter, but the bulb will still be in the ground. That bulb will then, once the next growing season starts through the winter and through to the spring, that will then grow into what we know as an onion. That will then later in the season spawn a flower that will eventually turn into seed. The seeds will drop and then more of those onions will grow. Organic is the most, I think, misunderstood term in all of gardening. Organic doesn't mean no chemicals, which is what most people think, but it simply means that any chemicals that are reduced are still in their natural form, that have come from a natural source. In organic farming and growing, we can still use fertilizers that are in a fairly concentrated chemical form, but those fertilizers have come from things like fish and seaweed and other nitrogen-rich sources. Germination. To germinate something is the process in which a seed finally turns from a seed and actually sprouts its first plant life. The act of taking something from a seed to a plant is what we call germination. Propagation. The other way a lot of plants, and especially a lot of things that we grow and eat, reproduce is not actually going from a seed, but it's through propagating. Common crops that we propagate are garlic, where once you harvest a garlic plant, you'll probably know that you'll have a bulb of garlic that is then full of the individual cloves. The way that we actually grow garlic is if you then take one of those individual cloves, plant it in the ground, that will then sprout a whole new plant, which will then, towards the end of the season, grow its own bulb full of many more cloves. That's not to say garlic doesn't go to seed. In the wild, it does go to seed, but us, when we're growing it, we never grow it from seed. Which is when it's important to mention true to seed. The reason that we propagate so much is not a whole lot of plants are true to seed. A lot of fruit trees like apples and avocados and even lemons. If I was to take an apple seed of a favorite apple variety, maybe a Royal Gala, plant that in the ground and manage to get it to germinate, the plant that will eventually spawn will not actually produce those Royal Gala apples. The reason for this is that when a tree fruits, it's because you have had the pollen taken from a male flower, most likely from a different plant, that is then put on the female flower of what eventually fruits, and the DNA in that seed is actually the combination of the two trees, which at that point is a genetic lottery, as opposed to propagating from a plant that is already growing that variety of fruit that you want. Nitrate and nitrite. When I said that plants eat a lot of nitrogen, that's not exactly true. Plants generally can't actually absorb nitrogen. They need it in forms of nitrate and nitrite that the plant can actually use. So what happens when we're putting something that's nitrogen rich into a soil? All of the microbes, fungus and bacteria in that soil are actually going to break down that nitrogen and then spit it out into forms of nitrate and nitrite that plants' roots can actually absorb. Compost. If you watch any gardening video, you've probably seen someone talk about compost. Oh, just plant it in some compost, put some compost on top, etc. What actually is it? Because before I knew what it was, I assumed that it was something quite gross, but it's actually something quite cool. The way that you get compost is when you take some really nitrogen rich plant material, which is generally really leafy stuff or the really green parts of a plant, and mix it with really carbon rich parts of plant material, a lot of the woody material, brown leaves, that sort of thing. If you put them all together in a big pile, the microbes that are then in there will start to eat that, produce a lot of heat, and that will break down all of that material into something that will come out just looking like soil. And it might sound gross that you're essentially rotting a bunch of plant material, but what comes out at the end is something that doesn't smell. It's really completely fine to touch. It smells just like a forest floor. In fact, you are just replicating in a very speedy way the process that naturally occurs on forest floors. Trellis. A trellis is just a frame or method or way to help a climbing plant grow upwards. Things like beans and tomatoes aren't actually able to produce a strong enough central stem of the plant to stand upright the same way that a tree does. They instead want to climb an existing structure, and by providing them with a trellis, we're providing them with a really easy to climb structure so that the plant can grow upright. Growing stuff from seed for the vast majority of what you're going to want to be growing is actually really easy. The only real gotcha is that there are a fair few plants that do really want to be direct sown, or that might have some slightly abnormal requirements to get the seed to germinate. The best thing that you can do is always just read the back of the packet. However, 80% of plants all want to be sown in the same way. You just want to go about 1/2 centimeter deep. In terms of seed mix, you can go really simple. Just use your bed mix or potting mix, whatever you have, and just make sure to nowhere near the seed leave any of the bigger chunks of woody material that's in your seed mix. I've never had an issue with doing that. The next big mistake that most beginners will make is, funnily enough, actually only sowing one seed in each individual compartment. Instead, what you want to do is in each of your little seed holes, just sprinkle a little bunch depending on the seed. Is you just want to drop at least a couple of seeds up to, really a handful into each little cell. And then what you want to do is you can just lightly brush over and cover. I have already pre-moistened a tiny bit the soil that's in here. And then once they sprout and have grown up a little bit, you don't need to go and pull them apart or anything. You just want to cut off as many of the seedling shoots as there are and just leave whichever one is in there and looking the strongest. The next thing I think is really important to cover that a lot of beginner gardeners have no idea about is just some plant first aid. As you're going around and looking, you might start noticing some issues with some of your plants. Like this one here, a lot of the bottom leaves that are touching with the mulch have started to grow out really yellow and are starting to look a bit bad. And the best protection from pests and disease and that sort of thing is just trying to keep your plant healthy, and it's always completely fine to just amputate any of the leaves that are really looking not that great. As long as any given plant has a couple, it will still be able to produce enough energy for the plant to then produce more growth to fix itself. But if you leave any sort of disease leaf or anything that you leave on there, you're really helping expose the plant to issues. How do you know when to water your garden? There is so many variabilities in temperature and time of day and part of the growing season that you're in that I can't just give you an answer of twice a week, once a day, anything like that. The easiest way to tell that will cover you the most amount of time is just feel the soil 1 to 2 knuckles down, and you just want to know that that is quite moist. Like this is here, it should slightly clump together, but not too much. That's such a good amount of moist. It's not overly wet that the roots will rot, but you have enough moisture in the bed for the water to be there for when your plant wants it. And then, I watered these last night, so that's about right. But then anytime it does feel dry down to that depth, that's a good time to give your plants a good water. And I think generally Even though you don't want to be watering your plants too much, a very common issue is when you do water them, not watering them enough. Just about the worst thing that you could do is water your plants every day, but not much, so that you only ever have a tiny shallow part of actually moist soil. Your plants will never develop deep, meaningful roots that can support heaps of growth. So what you do want to do is when you water it, actually give it a hell of a watering, which if you're just hand watering, does take a fair while. I do think a really good investment is something like drip irrigation or something like that, where you can turn the tap on, let it do its thing for a half an hour, however long your system will take, and then turn it off. Because I think the main thing that will lead you to underwatering your plants is just the sheer amount of time that it can take, especially once you get to have a few decent sized beds. Hand watering will just take way too long. You'll become unmotivated and your plants will die. The next big tip is just to understand and be aware that some plants have some really big gotchas. Blueberries are such a great example in that they require a different soil pH, a different acidity level than nearly any other plant that you're going to try and grow. If you were to plant blueberries in just some normal potting mix, they would die and not look too good. Another example is carrots. This is where I grow my carrots. The reason they're in such a weird, funky, separate container is that carrots really need to be direct sown. If you were to, I honestly think it's quite criminal that nurseries will sell seedlings of carrots, because if you transplant them, if you so much as basically touch the taproot at the bottom of that baby carrot, the plant is probably going to die, or at the very least be very, very unhappy and essentially not grow properly. So before you grow any crop, just make sure to do a quick Google of any potential issues or different growing quirks that they might have, because there's so many out there. The next tip, and this one is probably one of the biggest that will produce the biggest results for you, and that is to make sure to subscribe to me. Because even though these patches are a bit bare right now, it's because over summer I let all of those annuals die off, and then I had a couple-month gap because I had a baby. And now that we're in winter, you get to see someone with a fair bit of growing experience take a fairly bare garden patch, and that is genuinely my home garden, into something that is really productive. And thankfully, because I'm someone in the southern hemisphere, which we have such limited content, especially garden content that's really seasonal dependent, targeted towards us, I'm going to be making so many guides about what to plant in what months and what to be doing in what months, and the sort of content like that that we're really starved for here. If there's something you'd like to see or any additional questions that you have about this topic or this video, make sure to leave them in the comments. If you're enjoying it, please give it a thumbs up. And the last piece of advice that's probably the best that you're going to get, I get from my day job in tech consulting, and that's fail often and fail fast. If you really want to shortcut your first couple of years of growing experience, the best thing that you can do is in your first year, run a bunch of experiments so that you can really quickly work out what good looks like in your area. Some examples of this is it really does take a fair bit of time to work out how much you need to be watering your seedlings. If I was to start off learning how to grow stuff all over again, I'd tackle this by having, say, 4 or 5 separate trays that I'm going to purposely water at different intervals. I might have one that I water once a day, another one that I water twice a week, another one that I water once a week, and another that I just try to water by eye. And then you can actually see over maybe 4 or 5 weeks of that growth development, you're going to be able to see what would normally take you those 4 or 5 years to work out the differences between those different things. Ultimately, the thing that prevents us from growing in skill really quickly as home gardeners is the fact that we're so restricted by seasons that we only get one chance a year to try and grow tomatoes really well. So if we can really dedicate our first year to purposely killing some plants by overfeeding them, overwatering them, putting them in shady spots, putting them in different parts of the yard, and growing identical plants under different conditions, we can really, really quickly understand exactly how to get the best results for your given yard and area and water chemistry. And in the spirit of failure, something I'm doing right now is I'm running a bunch of experiments on trying to grow tomatoes in colder climates as a bit of a hobby project, and also because I don't actually know when my growing season starts here, because what we have considered conventional wisdom in home gardening for decades is actually starting to get disproven a lot in the last 10 or so years. So why not run my own experiments? Especially because in Australia, a lot of the conventional wisdom is coming from places like England and the US, where they actually have quite colder and different seasons. I currently have some pretty decent sized sprouting tomatoes that I planted maybe a month ago, and it's now in winter, but they probably will die. It's just a question of when. So don't be afraid to kill plants in order to make your next 40 years of growing a lot better. And please let me know down in the comments, what are some experiments that you've run in your garden? Or what are some big failures that you've had? See you next time.